y'all, this is Mrs. Ryan, and apparently my video on careers cut out. So I wanted to pick up really quick with the last few careers in psychology that we need. And I was talking about in human factors psychology a little interesting tidbit about car usage and how women are in fact less likely to get into car accidents than men. I know that sometimes it feels like people are pretty degrading towards female drivers, but in fact, based off of research statistics, we know that women are actually less likely going to get into a car accident. However, if women are in car accidents, they're actually more likely to die, which is kind of a problem. And why is that? It's because a lot of vehicles are designed for a male frame. People who are taller, people who have broader shoulders, and so in fact things like seatbelts and airbags, they deploy in a way to protect men, but actually can create damage for women. And so in human factor psychology, we look at designing spaces that function for a variety of people, whether that be based off of physical characteristics, or if we're talking about gender specifically, or even if we're looking at people who have different types of cognitive abilities. If you look at education level, for example, or things that are being designed for children versus things that are being designed for adults, that's what human factor psychology is all about, kind of that engineering and psychology combined with one another. Now, I'm going to move myself a little bit so you can see this better. A really interesting kind of psychology, which is another nice blend of business and psychology, is going to be consumer psychology. Sometimes we look at consumer psychology as being something like advertising or marketing, and a lot of times these individuals will work with those types of production for products. But how is it that I'm going to market or display a product that increases the likelihood that someone is going to buy it? So what you might see a consumer psychologist working with is advertising and different kinds of ad campaigns and that sort of a thing. But they actually might do research for advertising agencies or for marketing agencies, things that look at like what colors are the most pleasing, or when a person is going to encounter a color, what does that color make them think of? And then disseminate that information to the corporation who has employed them. You might have a consumer psychologist who is tasked to work for a company to look at how their stores are laid out. Where do you locate certain products? Why should they be located there? What's going to increase the likelihood that someone purchases a product based off of its location within the physical store. And so our consumer psychologists are much more likely going to be engaging in that research aspect of psychology, but they're doing it with the purpose of selling products and a way to sell products to help out a business or some sort of company or corporation. Now, the types of psychologists that most people think of are going to be the psychologists that deal specifically with helping individuals who have different types of emotional, behavior, or social problems and working through those particular problems. And so we look at a counseling psychologist, and a counseling psychologist is somebody who specifically provides therapy to individuals. This might be someone who works in a specific field, like a marriage counseling, for example. We know, of course, that when two people get married, there's all kinds of differences and change and things like that can happen. And sometimes those marriages fail. And one of the best things that a person can do if they find themselves in their marriage starting to disintegrate is getting an outside, unbiased figure to be involved in that process as a way to create healing between the two members. So you might have something like a marriage counselor. You might also look at school counseling. Many of you belong to a school that should have at least one, if not many, school counselors. Your school counselor is going to be helping you with your academic success in school, but also helping to refer for services when you have emotional or behavioral problems, That's something that a school counselor might be engaged in. So we have this branch of counseling psychology. However, somewhat separate from that is the type of psychologist known as a clinical psychologist. This specific branch of psychology is the one that is going to work by studying and assessing and treating people with mental illness. So while a person who has mental illness might find themselves in counseling, that counseling is often with other people as like part of a group, or it's towards like a specific issue in their lives, and it's not about treating mental illness. Instead, it's a clinical psychologist who would be responsible for helping to treat an individual who has a mental illness. So clinical psychologists often have either their own private practice, they might be part of like a behavioral health group or something like that. You also typically see them working in different types of social systems as part of the government. So things like prisons and jails, for example, which have a significantly high number of individuals with mental illness who are housed in those kinds of facilities. And so a clinical psychologist is often someone who would be on hand to help in the treatment of that individual. But then this might also be a clinical psychologist who works at a college or university and studying that mental illness and creating different types of treatment techniques and doing that kind of research. So clinical psychologists, they're ones who might be found at the university level. However, they're also the type of psychologists who might be kind of out in that private practice, working for an organization that is treating those with mental illness. And now finally, our last one, and this is where we often get a lot of confusion in psychology, and that is the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. So a psychologist is going to be someone who has a PhD in psychology, meaning they have a professional doctorate degree through a university, and that's how they became a psychologist. Whereas a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. They're an MD, and their specific practice for medicine is with mental health and the brain and psychology. And so this is the real difference between the two, is the type of education that this person received, as well as how would they go about treating individuals. So a psychiatrist is somebody who is a medical doctor, and that is the branch of medicine that they work in. Similarly to how there are people who are in gastroenterology or cardiology, we have people who are in obstetrics and gynecology, that those are special fields in medicine. Psychiatry is another special field in medicine. And so your psychiatrist is often someone who works in some sort of medical practice, whether that be a private doctor's office, it could be somebody who works in a hospital, for example, and they often are much more involved in things like drug treatments, because as medical doctors who are allowed to write prescriptions for different kinds of drug therapies, that's one of their primary roles. And so they might work in some ways as like a counseling psychologist or a clinical psychologist, because they're working often with people with mental health. They are still, however, a medical doctor. And so that's our clear distinction between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. So again, I apologize that my video cut out about the different careers in psychology. So we will call this Unit 1, Part 3B, and the other one is Part A. But either way, I hope you all have an excellent day. Thank you for joining me.